There are two ways in which we make a decision about anything. The first is a more conscious one in which we observe a situation or a thing, understand it, and make a deliberate decision after thinking about it over a period of time. And the second type of decision making is when we see something or some situation and have an intuition or a gut feeling as to what to make out of it. And this type of decision making happens in the first 2 seconds. It happens in the blink of an eye. And many times it's the right decision. Welcome to Books and Brew, and I'm your host Mayur Ghatge. And today I'm going to talk about a book called Blink, which is about those first 2 seconds of decision making. This book is written by one of my favorite authors slash thinkers of our era, Malcolm Gladwell. Although it's an old book published in 2005, but what this book talks about is so fascinating that you'll be amazed on how we make decisions unconsciously in the blink of an eye and how it's still so misunderstood by nearly all of us. We all have had an instance when we had a gut feeling about something and we were thankful we went by our gut feeling. We can't explain that gut feeling or why it's the right decision, and we might think it's just a fluke. But what Malcolm Gladwell tries to explain in this book is that this decision that we make in a blink of an eye is very rational, it's thoughtful, and we can actually train ourselves to be good at such snap judgments. This book is about appreciation of this type of thinking and enormous power it has in our everyday life, both good as well as bad. In this episode, I'll talk about 3 ideas from the book to highlight the importance of snap judgments we make, and hopefully by the end of this episode, you would want to give this book a read. The first idea I'll talk about is what Gladwell refers to as thin slicing. Thin slicing is our unconscious mind's ability to find patterns in situations and behavior based on very narrow slices of experience. So let me narrate a story to explain further. A psychologist named John Gottman from University of Washington runs a love lab where he makes couples sit in a room, hooks them up with sensors to monitor their sweat levels, skin temperature, stress levels, etc., and monitors them with 2 cameras to capture their facial expressions. He then asks the couples to talk. And during these talks, John Gottman encodes the facial expression of both the partners into various emotions like disgust, contempt, anger, defensiveness, whining, neutral, and so on. This way, a 15-minute conversation between a couple is translated into a row of emotions which are quantified numerically minute by minute. For example, disgust can be quantified as 1, contempt can be quantified as 3, so on and so forth. This emotional interpretation of every minute is then verified with the sensor data, and based on these calculations, Gottman has proved that if he observes 15-minute conversation between a couple, he can predict with 95% accuracy whether that couple will stay together 15 years later. Doesn't this sound mind-boggling? I mean, how can anyone tell with so much certainty if a marriage will last in just 15 minutes, and that too with 95% accuracy? To just give a situational analogy, this accuracy is more than the efficacy of any COVID-19 vaccine that's coming out. I'm recording this episode on 2nd December of 2020, so unless someone comes with a vaccine with efficacy more than 95%, which is difficult, Gottman's accuracy is definitely more than any COVID-19 vaccine that is ever going to come out. This accuracy is as good as guessing whether you will see the sun today. Okay, again, unless you're living in the Pacific Northwest in the United States, then you might end up not seeing the sun for months. But jokes apart, I'll ask all the listeners to think about this in their own personal life. And I'm sure you'll find an evidence that you are able to guess something with very high certainty in a blink of an eye. Let me give a personal experience. My close friends, Elaine and George Costanza, whenever they call or text, just by the way they are texting, I can make a guess if they are happy or sad or frustrated. I might not know the details, but I can definitely get a sense of it. So this is what Gladwell means by thin slicing. Extrapolating by just observing patterns in very short events or behaviors of people. Let me give another story narrated in the book. A study done by psychologist Samuel Gosling, where he studies personalities of 80 students and asks their close friends to judge them on 5 aspects of their personality. He then asked random strangers to just visit the dorm rooms of these 80 students for just 15 minutes and asked those strangers to evaluate those 80 students on the same personality traits. Gosling found that the close friends of those 80 students didn't do significantly better than the random dorm rooms observers did in guessing the personality. There were some traits like whether the student is reserved, sociable, or uncooperative, where friends did better at estimating, while traits whether the student is organized, calm, weak willed, or independent, random dorm room observers did equally good or even better in some cases. If you think about it, this might come across as so incredible, but it really isn't. This is what thin slicing is. The second idea I'd like to introduce today is called the storytelling problem. Gladwell says that when someone is asked to explain their decision, we typically reason with our conscious mind, and mostly this is not able to explain the decisions we take by our gut feeling or our intuition. So that's why many times we end up reversing our decision when we are asked to explain, and not because our gut feeling is wrong, but just because we are not able to articulate the gut feeling very well. The decisions we make from our unconscious mind has reasoning behind the locked doors is what Gladwell says. And this is the reason why we shouldn't always ask people why they like what they do, because their answers aren't always able to justify their decisions. Let me tell an anecdote from the book regarding this. In early 1980s, Coca-Cola came up with a new Coke to beat Pepsi in the market. The reason was that in late 1970s, there were blind tasting campaign run by Pepsi where habitual Coke drinkers were given Coke and Pepsi, and almost a huge majority of them preferred Pepsi over Coke in the blind taste tests. This made Coca-Cola come up with a new recipe for their product, and they released this calling it the new Coke. In their own blind tasting tests, the new Coke came out to be as good as Pepsi or even better. But when the product actually launched in the market, the new Coke failed miserably. It was a disaster. Surprising, right? Turns out that this was because typically tastings are done on small quantities of sample, and this doesn't really translate to the drinking experience of an entire bottle. Pepsi, being the sweeter cola, tastes good in small quantities, but Coke tastes better when you have the whole bottle. Let me give another example of blind tastings gone wrong. There was a study on jams, and a panel of jam experts were asked to rate 44 jams in the market. Now, college students were also asked to do the same, come in and rate these jams. It turned out that college students did equally good as jam experts at rating the jams in order of how good they are. And now, in a second experiment, the students and the jam experts were asked to explain why they rated the jams the way they did. It turned out that the college students were not rating the jams the way they did earlier. They were all over the place. But the jam experts were still pretty consistent in their ratings. And this is because asking someone to explain their decision taken unconsciously makes them change their decision to fit the rational reasoning they can come up with. This is, however, not the case with jam experts because they were actually trained and they have the knowledge to understand the intricacies of jam making and its flavors and its textures. But as students, they didn't really know all of this. They just understood which tastes better and which doesn't. Similarly, in our Coke Pepsi story, people aren't always able to tell the difference why Pepsi tasted better or why Coke didn't. And that's why extrapolating the outcome to come up with a new product went wrong for Coke. So, what Gladwell claims is these blind tasting tests are fundamentally flawed. It's because we as normal consumers are not able to explain our tasting experience in words and thus our decisions as well. And I have had similar experience with wine tasting, and I guess most of you too who have tried it. So when people are forced to explain their decision, which are made unconsciously, most of the times they run out of the language to articulate those decisions as they are made behind the locked doors of our mind. and thus we often tend to change our decision so that we can justify it and eventually make wrong judgments. However, Gladwell stresses that with practice, we can articulate them and explain our unconscious decision making well. The third idea from the book I'd like to touch upon is when our snap judgments go wrong. Let's go through a story from the book for this. This is a story about shooting a guy named Amadou Diallo who was from Guinea living in Bronx. It was a bad neighborhood where he was living and it was known for drug peddling. So this guy Diallo used to sell scarves and clothes, and after coming from work, one day he went downstairs for reasons that are not known. As he's standing there, a cop car with four cops inside drove past him, and the cops saw Diallo, who just looked back at them with curiosity and didn't move. The cops got down and they started asking questions to Diallo. But turns out Diallo was new to the United States and he could hardly speak any English at that time. Diallo got nervous and he put his hand in his pocket and started running to his apartment. The cops threatened him to shoot, and one of them, in this aroused situation, shouted that there is a gun in his hand, while the other cops started firing at Diallo. It turned out Diallo had wallet in his hand, but by the time the shooting ended, 41 rounds were fired at Diallo. So here the snap judgments made by the police officers went very wrong. Later research in the police system concluded that multiple cops in a single car often leads to an arousal of emotions and thus increased number of shootings. Had there been one cop only, he would have waited for backup before shooting at Diallo, and probably this crisis would have been averted. And this is what Gladwell calls arousal leading to mind blindedness, which eventually leads to wrong snap judgments. There are other reasons when you can go mind blind and make wrong snap judgments, and Gladwell goes through them in details with case studies to support his argument. Blink is not a book that says snap judgments are great or they are terrible. It's a book that says they are both and they just exist. So it's better we understand them as much as we can and make use of them. The book has a lot of case studies and interesting findings which are very counterintuitive to start with. It talks about how the marketing gurus in companies use this unconscious decision making ability of humans to their advantage and sell as margarine instead of butter by just changing the color of margarine and its packaging. Did you know that margarine is originally white in color, but just to make it as a replacement for butter, it is made yellow in color and the packaging is also made in yellow? Feels like we are living a lie till now, right? I mean, at least that's what I felt. The book also has story on how Pete Sampras, the great tennis legend, didn't really know how he plays the forward hand topspin the way he does. He believed that he rolls his wrist while doing so, but turned out he doesn't roll his wrist at all. No tennis legend rolls their wrist while playing the topspin. Now, one might argue that these are the best people out there and they know what they are doing, but turns out they aren't. Our decision making is such a complex process which we don't necessarily know entirely, and when asked about it, we come up with reasons that make rational sense than actual sense. There are anecdotes and stories in the book where Gladwell claims that analyzing more and getting more information can actually be counterintuitive, and we are actually better off making judgments with thin slicing or with the minimal information that we have. The new information just keeps on confusing and actually works counterproductive. So, Blink is all about understanding these snap judgments. It is rated at about 3.9 on Goodreads and is one of the early books written by Gladwell. For those who are not aware of Gladwell, the other books written by him are Outliers, Talking to Strangers, Tipping Point, David and Goliath, and all of them are very insightful reads into human mind and the world around us. If you are listening this episode until this point, means that you are into podcasts. So you can actually check out Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History podcast. Anyways, I recommend this book to everyone with curious minds to get more insights into human decision making. And even if you are not into this genre of book reading, you will definitely not be disappointed after reading this book. I will not do a brewing section for this episode as I plan to come up with something very interesting in the next one, so stay tuned. Do let me know how you like this episode and if you have any recommendations on books you'd like me to discuss. My email ID is booksandbrewpodcast@gmail.com. For more such episodes, subscribe to my show on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, on my YouTube channel, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. Please do like or rate this show on whichever platform you are listening. Until next episode, spread the word, keep reading, happy listening. The music for this episode is given by Rahul Thomre.